Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Dami Adewale.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today we'll be looking at various ways that small charities in particular can make use of artificial intelligence in their everyday work. Or in other words, how can people working for organisations whose staff can be counted on one hand make their busy working lives a little easier through some simple to use technology?
We're joined for this discussion by John Fitzgerald, who is the Digital Evolution Manager at the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, or SCVO. John supports Scottish charities large and small to make better use of digital tools to increase their effectiveness. And he joins us from Edinburgh. Hello, John.
Hello, nice to be here.
Nice to have you with us. So to start off with, John, the AI landscape is a fast-moving one. You two work for a charity. So would you be able to pinpoint any single AI tool that has most benefited your working life?
So one directly that's had a small but noticeable impact has been using AI tools to transcribe and note calls. So in part of my work, I provide a lot of one-to-one digital support. And within that, what I'm doing is listening to the charity in their context. We're capturing a lot of ideas about how they can make progress. And I always send a note afterwards because we're often going into technical terminology that they're not going to necessarily want to note while we're having the call. So historically, I'd have to kind of scribble notes as I went along, pull it all together, and there'd often be a wee delay to kind of get the information together. So using AI transcription, I can do that much more quickly. I can review it within minutes of finishing the call. And that's allowed me to run many more of these calls and kind of do them more frequently, which has been a benefit.
Could you tell us about some of the other practical AI-driven tools that could benefit charities more broadly?
Yeah.
For example, in things like funding applications. I mean, you mentioned transcription services, some of those other practical uses.
I think one that we see and hear about a lot, and lots of charities have asked me about this over the years, has been funding applications, because that's something that every charity has to do on a fairly frequent basis. And often in smaller charities, you don't have somebody with a fundraising focus. It's maybe a CEO or somebody doing a program that has to kind of carve out time and try and do the funding applications. So it's a very kind of obvious area that people are looking for extra support. What we find is people that are doing it well are not saying, I'm going to give AI a one-line prompt and kind of cross my fingers and hope it's right. People are using it more in a kind of granular way to maybe help with meeting a word count or taking something in one document and trying to reformat a wee bit. And I think what's interesting to me there is that AI tools maybe help the process feel a bit smoother and more productive, but you do still need to have that critical judgment. So what we tend to see is charities where they brought a bit of insight to the table, they know what good looks like, they're ones which will see the benefit. And I guess a worry that we see in some funders have shared this with me is they see organizations where they're relatively new to fundraising, they've leaned heavily in AI, and that's kind of really obvious, and it leads to a weaker application. And that's often because it's quite generic. It's not really talking in specific terms about what the organization does. It's a kind of buzzword bingo application, if you like.
So how do you suggest charities avoid that pitfall when using AI in their funding applications?
Well, I think it's really about not losing sight of you need to be able to talk about your organization and what's the difference you're making. And that's really a kind of human process. I know it can often feel like a kind of you're having to navigate this language and talk about your work in a way that will catch the eye of a funder. But most funders that I've talked to, and I've run a few workshops with funders as well, reflecting on what AI might mean for them. And what they do come down to is what they're really interested in is the community and ideas behind an application and the way that it's written about. It can be well phrased or poorly phrased, but they're usually able to kind of see through that and get the ideas that are behind the application. So I think our advice would be take your time, do it in steps, and build in time to read it back and see, is that really talking about your work in a way that you would want and a way that you would stand behind?
And before we move on to a slightly different area, are there any other AI uses you've seen in the sector that might be particularly helpful for small charities to know about?
So a theme that we're seeing a lot of charities trying AI techniques and tools is where they're trying to make sense of a lot of free-form information. So really frequently in the charity sector, I think you have a situation where you've got a lot of rich qualitative insight. So maybe you've talked to a lot of people who are using your services, or your frontline workers are having one-to-one sessions and getting that kind of real contextual picture of what's going on. one of the challenges, I think, in small organizations is you build that up, but then you don't maybe have capacity to kind of pull the themes out of it or see what kind of categories are sitting within that data. So AI tools can help with that. So they can maybe help you start to pull out a sentiment analysis or a thematic analysis. The big challenge, I think, is around privacy and GDPR. So really you've got two choices. So one approach that organizations are taking is anonymizing. So making sure that any data you put into an AI system has got all the personal details removed. So that's a very safe way of proceeding. It can be quite laborious to do. Another way is to think about if you're using a system, maybe you're using Copilot within Office 365, you've got some extra assurances there about where data is processed and held. You're not putting it into a third-party system. And I think if you can navigate those privacy challenges, it can maybe give you a capability to look at data you might not have looked at in much depth before. And I think particularly, we see examples of funders have reported that, and that's something they're doing is they're getting a lot of reports from grantees. They're maybe not always having capacity to go through them in detail, and AI can be a way to help explore that, provided they get the privacy elements right.
Just picking up on that privacy issue, John, for
Yeah,
those who aren't really familiar with that, what are the particular issues associated with AI in that area?
there's a few. I'll try and kind of go through them in steps. So the first one really is about training data. So very often, if you're using a third-party tool, and maybe when you're not paying for, part of the trade-off is the developer of that tool needs more training data. They need more prompts. So whenever you put a prompt or an input into the tool, that could be used as training data in a future iteration of the tool. And that's really important for the developers because they want to keep improving the quality of what they're doing. But it means that personal information could get stored in a way that you wouldn't want it to be. And maybe potentially also reveals there's been a famous kind of case in the tech industry where one tech company, an engineer was working with AI to work out the best launch date for their product. AI kind of helped them with that. Another company came along and said, we're also wondering about a launch date. They said, well, don't try that date because this other company has already got something coming at that date. So that kind of obvious gotcha moment doesn't happen so often, but it is a good illustration of what can happen where your conversation, your input becomes a part of the learning for a future model. So it's a bit of a worry. The other way it crops up, I think, in particular in transcription tools, is a standalone transcription tool. People want to kind of capture a big market with that. So what they often do is they build in a feature where to access one part of the product, you sign up for the service, then you find it's got access to your calendar, and it's not just joining calls where you've chosen it to happen, it's joining all the meetings in your diary. And that is a total privacy nightmare because, most of us, I think, will have some meetings, some conversations where some transcription would be fine, but we always want to be able to make the choice. If you're thinking of AI as an intern who's there with a notepad, you wouldn't want them to just randomly follow you to every meeting. You'd want to say, right, well, that's something where we need some support. We'll switch it on, but if we switch it off, it needs to stay off. So that's a kind of example where the product design, the features in AI products are often pushing against privacy. And what you really want to be able to do is make conscious choices about where you're using it and where you're not.
And is it broadly the case then that AI tools that people pay for tend to be more ring fenced in terms of safeguarding that information?
Generally, yes. So if you're using a well-recognized product, Microsoft is one example where people have obviously been asking the question about where is the data stored and how is it managed. And if that is part of a bigger subscription, you've got more protections available to you. And that's because, if you're paying for a service, you'll have a service level agreement. But it's always worth having a look just to see how it's being approached, because quite often companies, what they're wanting to do is maximize the amount of access to data they've got, because that enables them to train a product more quickly. But it's always worth having that sense check and saying, if we had a very sensitive or confidential conversation, where is that data going to be stored? Are we going to be able to remove it if we need to do that? And, as a further question, if somebody came and said, right, I'm making a subject access request, I want a copy of everything you've got, would that be easy to do or would it be difficult to do?
And John, you've briefly touched on some tools there. So could you just speak about any examples of charities making good use of these tools?
Yeah, so one example I've seen that's been really good has been in the advice space. So Citizens Advice Scotland in the pandemic. Before the pandemic, they were locally based. So your primary way of getting in touch with Citizens Advice was to go along in person to your local branch. They had to set up a national helpline because obviously with social distancing, people couldn't just randomly show up. And what they did was they used a bit of AI there, a bit of voice recognition. And what it meant was you could start your call to national helpline number, say where you're from, and it would automatically connect you through to your local branch. So it was a very straightforward process for people calling the helpline. It saved Citizens Advice a lot of admin time because they didn't have to manually match calls. It was just happening automatically. But what they did then was that extra capacity they had, their advisors could focus on doing the work, doing the expert advice that they're needed for. So that was a nice example where AI was involved, not to provide lots of very specific expertise, but to kind of help the process be a bit smoother and more effective. Another example that a charity in Ayrshire are exploring at the minute is they support carers, so people who are caring for family members or friends. And one issue that they've seen is people are often looking for advice, late in the evening or early in the morning. They've got really busy lives. They maybe need a bit of hands-on support to kind of understand something when they have a spare moment. So that charity are looking at whether AI tools could help provide basic advice and support in a kind of live, interactive way outside their usual office hours. One thing they're having to think through quite carefully is to make sure the system is designed so if somebody started asking questions about a safeguarding issue or where there was a risk factor present, is to make sure it would say, right, hang on a second, you need to call 999 or you need to get expert medical support or something like that. But that's an example where what they're thinking through is they've got the knowledge base, all the advice they'd normally give out. Is there a way to make that available even if their staff aren't sitting by the phone at that moment?
That point on safeguarding that you
Yeah.
mentioned there kind of moves us on quite well into the next question. So I was just wondering, what do charities need to consider from a governance perspective before using an AI tool?
There's quite a few things really, and that's been probably our number one question and conversation we've had in the last year. The way it's changed really has been about 2 years ago, a lot of people are still asking a question of like, what is AI or where is the potential? And now the conversation is much more along the lines of people are using it. We're pretty okay about that, but we want to make sure they're doing it responsibly and we've got a good governance arrangement in place. And what we would go back to is it's really important to use your values and your vision as a kind of starting point. So every charity will have ways that they want to operate. They'll have a purpose in mind, a reason why they exist, and what they want to happen in the world. Those can sound quite abstract, but actually they're quite good for helping you zero in on what's going to be effective for your organization. So within our own organization, what we did was we had open conversations with people using AI. So that was a kind of safe space where people could just be upfront and say, well, I've tried this, it worked quite well, or I've tried this and actually was a bit worried about the outcome and maybe wouldn't do it again. And that gave us a bit of a body of practical knowledge and a sense of what kind of things were people trying out in practice. We then had conversations around our vision and values, around the way that we expect to work as an organization. And at that point, we pulled in the expert input from people on our IT team, people with an HR role. So that meant we could kind of triangulate with other policies. And what was interesting to us was that we already have IT policies, probably most organizations do. They're maybe not something you refer to every day of the week. You just kind of get on with stuff as you need to. AI, I think, is a bit different because there's so many products out there. There's real potential for people to kind of go off piste and start using something in a way that you wouldn't expect. So we felt the really important thing to do is have something in place, even if it's a short policy that will get updated within a year. It's really important to have that starting point and also to have that based on conversations in the organization so that it really connects with people's practice and their everyday reality. And I feel that most organizations, even if you don't have a lot of technical expertise, probably do have the capacity to sit down and have a few conversations and get together something that would be a really good starting point and build from there.
In terms of that use then among staff in the organization, John, I think we
Yeah,
hear quite a bit about stealthing, don't we? I think
yeah,
where people are kind of using AI just kind of in the background.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of what issues that might raise and how charities can best manage it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting example, and I think it does go back to that point about the technology is moving really fast, but it also kind of, I think there's a really interesting Marmite aspect to AI because some people, maybe because of their work experience, their professional background, or just their own thoughts about reading and writing, might think, well, actually, it's kind of like cheating. And this comes up loads and loads in the education space as well, where you'll find some institutions, some teachers will be saying, right, it's a hard no. We don't want to see that in the classroom. We don't want to see students using it. A really interesting approach on that is a guy called Ethan Mollick, who's in the US. He's a professor of business studies. And what he's done is he said, well, look, people are going to use it. So I'd like to do that in the open. And we'll have conversations about, well, let's try an AI tool, but then let's bring our judgment to the table and say, is it effective and what's it missing? And what he's doing is saying this is going to become part of the way people do their work in the future. So it's kind of pointless to ignore it. I think on the working culture, where you want to get to is that openness feels okay, because I think the worry would be if you're taking a really hard line on it and saying absolutely no way, and we don't want to see it anywhere, there will be one or two people who'll do it anyway, but do it, as you say, under the radar. And that's quite problematic, not just from a reputational point of view, but from a learning point of view. Because if you're doing AI experimentation in the open and talking about the bad stuff as well as the good stuff, that helps everyone. Because if I try something out and say, you know what, that was a bad idea, and tell my colleagues about it, they won't all repeat the same mistake next week. They'll go, right, well, John tried it. It didn't work for him, so we'll try something else. So it's really important, I think, to build in that culture of openness. And I think that's can be tricky for leaders, I think, because often if you put an IT policy head on, sometimes the easiest thing to say is no, because that maybe cuts off the risk. But I think the worry would be it maybe cuts off the opportunity to learn and to grow with it.
Speaking of that culture of openness, then, if we're thinking about bigger charities and bigger teams, how can organizations stimulate effective AI usage from the bottom up?
Yeah, I think the bottom up point is so important. And the reason why I think it's important is because I think the really interesting thing about AI is it's not really a technical problem. So there's thousands of companies out there throwing billions of dollars at the technical stuff because they're all in a race to kind of get the best products and capture the market share as quickly as they can. What we bring to the table in charities is we know what work we're trying to do, we know what risks and vulnerabilities we're faced with. So we have that professional insight about what does good need to look like. And that's why I think having those conversations. So one thing that we've done is peer-to-peer learning groups for the sector where people have just come and shared, what have they tried and what have they learned from it. And I think most organizations could probably do that and do, a time where you maybe get together for an hour every couple of weeks, share a bit on what you've tried, what particular aspects were you looking for, and what was the outcome? Was it good? Was it bad? Would you change it? And doing that little bit of reflective practice can really be a very powerful way of learning together. And I think the interesting thing it can do is it can help more junior people feel kind of safe about being upfront about what they're trying. And it can also help senior people kind of sit back a bit and hear from their team what's making the difference and what maybe needs to be avoided.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how important it is for charities to consider their charitable missions when they're thinking about using new technology or AI, and can you give us some examples of that?
As I said earlier, I think one advantage we've got in the charity sector, we're kind of purpose driven. We've got a cause we're fighting for. And so that can be a really good North Star thing to aim for. When citizens' advice were looking at, well, where could AI be helpful? What they were thinking through is one really important factor for them is the advice needs to be delivered by a human and high quality and based on really reputable sources. So what they recognized there was it didn't look likely that they could use AI completely to do the whole job for them, but they could look at areas where they could access some efficiencies and do things a bit more quickly and straightforwardly. And what that would then do is give them capacity. And I think lots and lots of charities will be like that, where the work that you do is ultimately about human to human contact and expertise and really sound professional judgment. But there'll be areas where if you can lighten the admin workload, that will give you more ability to reach more people or do more work more effectively.
Because I imagine for some environmental charities, for example, they might have concerns around the impact of the AI tools in terms of water usage and that kind of thing that we hear about.
The environmental question is a really interesting one because I think there's two things going on. So the first thing is at an individual and organizational level, any digital tool is not going to be your biggest impact. Making 4 cups of tea a day, if that's your running rate of cups of tea, that may be up there with your AI usage. So at an individual level, it's a bit hard to see the big impact. Having said that, if you go and look and see what the AI industry is doing, it's building out data centers at a scale that's much, much bigger than we've seen before. So in Scotland, there's been a bit of controversy on that, where standard planning approach to a data center is to say, this is a very low environmental impact, so we should probably say yes, and we won't have lots of very rigorous environmental scrutiny. But if you look at what a hyperscale data center is, which is gigawatts of energy, so that's a city's worth of energy, if you wanted a kind of rule of thumb, that's really, really different. And I guess the worry would be you then see a situation where more and more AI usage drives more and more hyperscale data build out. And then before you know it, you've got lots of kind of white elephants that are maybe consuming a lot of grid capacity, using up a lot of water as well. So there is a worry there. One of the challenges within that is the leading players in the AI space are not really reporting their energy use and water use very transparently. So there's lots of work going on to try and challenge that and dig into it. And I think if it was an environmental organization right now, I'd probably be referencing that in the policy and maybe saying we'd like to look for AI and digital providers where they're being transparent about their resource use and look to kind of benchmark it as we go along. It's a bit of a challenge, I think.
And just thinking about these providers, then, could you just tell us more about the data sources that are training AI models? So, for example, LinkedIn, Reddit, etc. How can charities inform these, and what are the merits of doing so?
Yeah, that's a really interesting area in the communication space because there's quite a few things going on quite quickly. So the first thing is, I think what the AI companies would like to be able to do is consume all the data everywhere they possibly can. So one big case in the US has been the New York Times had a legal dispute with OpenAI because OpenAI had used a lot of New York Times content as part of its training data. New York Times argued that was a breach of copyright because they'd not had an agreement in place. OpenAI were trying to say, well, look, it's learning. It's a bit like somebody reading lots of newspapers and remembering it. But the courts at the moment are tending to rule in favour of the copyright holder because that's where the law sits at the minute. In the UK, there was a big consultation on copyright and AI. So the AI industry were saying, with copyright law as it is today, it might be impossible to get world-class AI. But the result of the consultation was 90+% of people said protect copyright. So that's there. I think the practical challenge facing charities is you can kind of go two ways. So one way is to say, we want people to use our ideas and our insight. So let's make our information open. So maybe we'll put it into platforms like LinkedIn or Reddit. So kind of put it in there so it kind of starts to show up in training data. One of the challenges is Wikipedia faced this, where they found that the amount of traffic from AI bots was totally hammering their servers. So they couldn't keep up with it. And they felt, well, actually, Wikipedia is not a kind of a training data source. We're there to provide information to people right around the world. So they're stepping back a bit and saying, we're not going to allow all our data to be consumed by AI training runs. It's a bit of a challenge, I think. Another related area is health information charities have been challenging Google because the Google AI search previews currently use a wide range of information sources. So if you search for a health condition, it's a little bit of a lottery about what will come up. So if lots of people have posted in a forum about your particular symptoms or condition, you might get something which is more forum based, possibly less reliable. And what the health information providers are saying, well, hang on a minute, we should have some kind of filtering or review process in place here so that trusted health sources are coming higher up the results. So it's a real paradox. I think there isn't a kind of magic answer at the moment, but what agencies who are in the kind of search space are saying is it's probably now time to pay attention and try and understand where the information sources are that are being used in training models and think about getting your content in there because it may be a way to boost your visibility. The other thing, which is a kind of very old-fashioned thing to say, is just having good content is still going to stay valuable. So if you're keeping your website up to date, if you've got expert articles on issues, if they're easily accessible by search engines, they'll probably also be consumable by AI as well. So it's a kind of keep on doing what you're doing sort of answer, I guess.
That disintermediation point that you
Yeah,
raised there, John, is quite an interesting
yeah.
one, particularly as you say for health charities in that space. Are there things that they can particularly be doing to try to reverse that? Because I know we all see these AI summaries, don't we,
Yeah,
when we do Google searches, etc.
it's a tricky one. There isn't, there's lots of parallels with how it was, when search engine optimization was a very hot topic. People would be paying a lot of money maybe to get advice on this. They'd be working really hard to optimize their pages. But again, there's no magic answer. And I think one of the challenges, particularly about search preview, is it's not just about specifically, maybe you see a result and think, that's not great. How can we work to make sure a better, more reliable preview is arriving? There's also the piece on if people's internet behavior changes. So if people's previous behavior was look at a list of search results, make a choice about which is best, then go and read the original source, and that maybe got them extra layers of information that was probably really helpful. Maybe now it's a more, you're guessing a preview in a conversation or something at the top of a search page, and that's where your inquiry stops, and that's maybe problematic. I think there'd be lots of organizations where you'd say, and I think Citizens Advice would probably be an example here, where you wouldn't want to optimize for fitting it all into a 50-word preview. You might want to make sure people did come through to your own pages and resources to get all the detail if that was what was needed.
And John, I wonder if we can just talk a little bit about specifics. If I'm the manager of a small animal charity in Nottingham, for example, what tools in particular might I be able to use? I wonder if you could name a few that might help make my job a little bit easier.
It's a really good question. There's thousands and thousands of tools out there. I think my first point would be maybe don't overlook what you might already have access to in your existing systems. That could be Google Gemini if you're in Google Workspace, or it could be Copilot if you're Microsoft. I would have a little look at what's there. I maybe wouldn't be giving everybody full access right away because that could be quite expensive, but I think it's worth having somebody in a kind of try stuff out role. ChatGPT is very good. I think particularly often people have looked at an early version of it and maybe said, well, it's not quite good enough. But if you keep looking at the latest versions, they do keep improving. Claude is also quite a useful tool and maybe has a bit more flexibility than some of the other chat-based tools. There's a few to try there, and I think I'd probably be saying it's not really sustainable to try everything all at once, even if you're feeling really keen. It's about maybe having one or two on the go at one time and just digging into how it's working. And I think particularly the piece I'd say is having those reflective conversations with your team where you kind of show you're working and say, I tried this, and look at the result and what do we think of it collectively. That can be a really powerful way of building both your confidence and your critical insight about what's being effective and what isn't.
And I wonder if you can just give us an insight into any particular costs that might be associated with those tools for charities.
Yeah, it's often in the region of, £20 a month-ish. So again, that's why you maybe don't want to be trying a whole raft of tools all at once. For me, I'd be saying it's worth doing that small scale experimentation and really make that kind of stick or twist decision and say, we're happy with it, it's giving us value, in which case we're maybe willing to pay for it. But I think jumping in and investing in loads of tools all at once would probably be a bit reckless, I guess. So it's getting that kind of balance right and saying you are consistently trying stuff and learning, but you're making sure you're investing when you're happy with the value and not kind of betting the farm on it.
And finally, I just wondered if you could look into your crystal ball and tell us maybe 5 or 10 years down the line. Obviously, AI is moving so fast. How do you think charities might be using it in, as I say, a decade's time or something like that?
It's funny, I ran a panel once where I got a lot of AI experts on the stage and said, tell me about 2 years' time, and they all laughed and said, that's far too long. But I think the really interesting thing to keep an eye on is going to be skills and insights. So going back to the Ethan Mollick piece about kind of learning how to use AI and a kind of alongside your existing judgment, I think there's really interesting questions about when we've got all these affordances, these kind of tools that help us do things a bit more quickly and a bit less manually. That's really beneficial. It gives us a really short-term boost to our capability. But what does learning look like over the longer term? I think a really interesting question a lot of people are asking is around how people enter the jobs market. And the charity industry, I think, is like many, many other sectors where there's lots of roles where people start out. You're not there with many years of experience behind you, but it's an entry-level job where you can kind of start to understand the context and show your capability. And I think a worry I would have is around AI could maybe strip out a lot of those kind of roles, and what you're left with, I think, might be where people are very capable at day one because they've got a lot of tools at their disposal, but that's a kind of brittle capability where it doesn't have the depth that you would have from a few years of experience.
I think that's a good place to finish off. So thank you very much for speaking with us today, John.
You're welcome.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with John, and that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producers are Jude Owen and Nav Powell.